You know what's wild? Your grandparents didn't just preserve food because they had to. They preserved food because they understood something we've completely forgotten. That the act of preservation itself was a form of rebellion against uncertainty, against hunger, against the terrifying reality that winter might not let them survive. But here's what nobody talks about. The real genius wasn't in the technique. The real genius was in the psychology. See, when we talk about the forgotten ways of food preservation, we usually list them like a grocery checklist. Smoking, salting, fermentation, root cellaring, canning, drying, boom, boom, boom. But what we're missing is the entire psychological framework that made those techniques actually work. Your grandparents weren't just preserving vegetables. They were building a mental architecture of safety. They were encoding abundance into their daily routines so deeply that the fear of scarcity never took root in their minds. Let me break this down in a way that'll change how you think about preservation forever. There were actually 3 layers to how our ancestors preserved food, and the modern survival movement has completely stripped away 2 of them. The first layer, the obvious one, the techniques. Fermentation produces beneficial bacteria that preserve vegetables and improve digestibility. Salt draws moisture out and prevents pathogens. Smoking creates compounds that inhibit mold and bacteria. These are facts, chemical facts. But that's only layer 1, and it's the least important one for actual survival. The second layer was the knowledge system. Your grandparents didn't have one recipe for fermented cabbage. They had dozens of variations based on altitude, temperature, water quality, type of salt available, humidity levels, and even the lunar calendar in some cases. This wasn't superstition, though people called it that. This was empirical knowledge refined across generations. They kept detailed notes, mental maps of what worked in what conditions. If you moved to a new region, you couldn't just import grandma's recipe. You had to adapt it. You had to observe. You had to think like a scientist, and that thinking made you resilient. But here's where it gets really interesting, and where we've completely lost the thread. The third layer, the one that actually made preservation work, was the economic layer. Preservation wasn't a hobby. It wasn't a weekend project. It was the primary economic activity of entire seasons. In autumn, preservation consumed the family's time, resources, and attention in the same way that your job consumes yours today. It wasn't optional. It wasn't romantic. It was as necessary as breathing, and that necessity shaped everything about how they approached it. Why does this matter for you right now, in this moment, in this world? Because we've turned preservation into an aesthetic. We've made it Instagrammable. We've stripped it of its necessity, which means we've stripped it of its power. Your grandparents didn't preserve food because they thought it was cool, or healthy, or sustainable. They did it because the alternative was starvation. And that knowledge of consequence, that weight of real stakes, changed how seriously they approached every single step. Now, let's talk about something radical. Most survival content treats preservation like you need to become an expert in 7 different techniques. Wrong. What you actually need is to understand the principle that made all those techniques work. That principle is this. Preservation is about extending the life of abundance past its natural season. And the psychological component of that is the most important variable. When your brain knows that you're actively extending your survival capacity, something shifts. You stop approaching tasks with casual interest. You approach them with a kind of reverence. Your ancestors didn't just ferment cabbage. They were literally transforming sunlight and soil into stored security. They were performing a kind of biological alchemy that meant their children would eat in January. Do you feel the weight of that? Because that's what made them good at it. Here's what the conventional preservation guides miss entirely. They tell you the techniques, but they don't tell you the hierarchy of preservation. Not everything deserves the same attention. Your ancestors knew which foods were most critical to preserve because they understood seasonal eating patterns down to the cellular level. Potatoes and root vegetables could last through winter with just proper storage. Apples could ferment or dry. But fresh herbs and certain greens? Those required a completely different strategy. The knowledge of which techniques to apply to which foods, and in what order of priority, that was the real intelligence. And here's the counterintuitive part that'll blow your mind. The forgotten ways aren't actually forgotten. They're avoided. We've deliberately chosen not to use them because they require something we don't have anymore. Time. Not just clock time, but seasonal time. Cyclical time. Your ancestors didn't preserve food in March. They preserved it in September and October. The entire society synchronized around this rhythm. Schools ended for harvest. Markets shifted. Labor was marshaled. Everything conspired to make preservation possible. We can't do that anymore. Or rather, we can, but it costs something we're not willing to pay. We've traded seasonal time for global supply chains. We've chosen constant abundance over the knowledge of cycles. And that trade-off has made us less resilient, not just agriculturally, but psychologically. We've lost the ability to trust our own systems of security. So let's get practical, because this isn't just philosophy. Let me give you the real hierarchy of what you should focus on if you want to actually build preservation capacity. First, focus on fermentation. Not because it's the most sophisticated, but because it requires the least infrastructure and the fewest fails. Fermentation is forgiving. The beneficial bacteria actually want to be there. You create the right conditions, anaerobic environment, salt ratio, temperature, and fermentation almost does itself. Second, focus on drying. Your ancestors dried far more than we realize. Not just meat and fish, but fruits, vegetables, even certain prepared foods. Drying is the oldest preservation method, and it works because of pure physics. Remove water, remove the possibility of microbial growth. Get a dehydrator, or use the sun. The variables are weather and time. That's it. Third, focus on cold storage if you have access to a proper root cellar or can create one. Your ancestors built entire structures around this. A root cellar isn't complicated. It's just a place that stays cold, stays humid, and stays dark. Underground is ideal, but basements work. Some of you could create cellar space in your climate if you wanted to. The key is understanding that certain foods have optimal storage temperatures. Potatoes like 38 degrees. Apples like 30 to 35. Root vegetables like 32 to 35. These aren't arbitrary numbers. They're the temperatures at which cell damage slows down enough that the vegetable stays viable. If you're in a warm climate, you can't rely on natural cold. But you can use water. Your ancestors used water wells and spring houses. They stored food in water, or stored food adjacent to water, that kept temperatures stable. There's a reason spring houses were built where they were. There's a reason they were structured the way they were. Every design choice was a response to solving a specific thermal problem. Now, there's something else that your ancestors did that we absolutely need to talk about, because it's the most forgotten aspect of all. They didn't just preserve food, they preserved the knowledge of preservation. They did this through teaching, yes, but more importantly, they did it through failure. They experienced their failures in real time, in small ways, year after year. A batch of kimchi went bad, they learned why. Meat dried improperly, they adjusted. Apples rotted in storage, they changed the conditions next year. We've engineered failure out of our food systems so completely that when failure occurs, we don't know what to do with it. Your ancestors failed constantly, and that failure was the teacher. We're terrified of failure, so we don't attempt anything that might fail. And because we don't attempt it, we never learn. Here's what I want you to understand about the psychology of preservation that changes everything. When you engage in preservation, you're not just storing food, you're storing time. You're literally capturing the energy and resources of the present and making them available to the future. That act, that deliberate act of providing for your future self, it changes your neural pathways. It creates a feedback loop of security that ripples through every other decision you make. Your ancestors weren't stressed about supply chains because they'd already solved the problem themselves. They knew, with absolute certainty, that they had the knowledge and the resources to feed themselves. That knowledge removed an entire category of anxiety from their lives. They could focus on other things because the food question was settled. We're missing that. We're floating in uncertainty. Now, I promised you that there's a resource that goes much deeper into this entire framework. And honestly, it covers the specific techniques in a way that's way more practical than I could fit into this video. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments. It's the real deep dive into how to actually build a preservation system for your own life. The truth is, your ancestors would be baffled by our modern approach to food. They'd look at a supermarket and see terrifying fragility. Thousands of products, all dependent on perfect logistics, all dependent on systems outside your control, all dependent on structures that could fail overnight. They wouldn't see abundance, they'd see vulnerability, wearing the mask of convenience. The genius of your ancestors wasn't in having perfect techniques. It was in understanding risk. They knew that risk is reduced through redundancy. Multiple preservation methods, multiple storage locations, multiple crops and food sources, multiple generations learning the same skills, so knowledge didn't die with one person. We've centralized everything. We've created efficiency at the cost of resilience. Here's where this gets really practical for your actual life right now. You don't need to become a homesteader. You don't need to quit your job and move to a farm. You need to build just one preservation system that you can actually maintain. Pick one food that you love. Pick one preservation method. Get good at it. Master it this season. Then, and only then, add another method or another food. The psychological shift happens when you have one thing that you know you've preserved correctly. One jar of fermented vegetables that you made with your hands, that you've tasted, that you know is safe and good. That one jar changes how you feel about your own competence. It changes how you think about the future. It's not the calories, though those matter. It's the knowledge. It's the proof that you can take raw resources and convert them into security. Now, I want to challenge one more thing that the traditional preservation guides get wrong. They make it sound like you need to preserve massive quantities. Your grandparents preserved massive quantities because they had to feed families of 8 or 10 through a 6-month winter. You might live alone. You might have a family of 3. Scale your preservation to match your reality. Small batches, regular batches. Build the skill and the habit, and the quantity will scale naturally. This is actually a bigger paradigm shift than it might sound. Your ancestors thought in terms of seasonal abundance that needed to be extended. We can think in terms of continuous, small batch preservation that builds competence while matching our consumption. You're not racing against winter. You're building a skill that will outlast any individual circumstance. And here's the really counterintuitive part. The preservation methods that require the most failure tolerance are actually the ones that build the most competence. Fermentation, for example. You can mess up a batch pretty badly, and it'll still be edible or at least interesting. Canning, on the other hand, is far less forgiving. A botulism contamination isn't something you learn from. It kills you. So if you're starting out, start with fermentation. Build confidence. The high failure tolerance methods are actually the gateway to the low failure tolerance methods. Here's something your ancestors understood that would shock modern nutritionists. Preservation methods that involve fermentation and long-term storage don't just preserve nutrients in some cases, they actually increase them. The beneficial bacteria produced during fermentation synthesize B vitamins. The long storage creates compounds that enhance bioavailability of minerals. What looked like simple food preservation was actually a form of nutrition enhancement. The food stored in winter was often more nutritionally dense than the fresh produce of summer. This matters because it means that preservation isn't just about extending calories, it's about extending optimal nutrition. When you ferment something, you're not just preventing spoilage. You're creating a probiotic product that's probably healthier than the original vegetable. That knowledge changes how you approach the whole endeavor. Now let me address the elephant in the room. You might be thinking, why should I care about any of this? I have a supermarket. I have grocery delivery. I have a food system that's worked for decades. And you're right, for now it works. But the entire history of human civilization shows us that systems that seem permanent are often fragile. And more importantly, the skills your ancestors developed weren't just insurance policies. They were expressions of competence and self-sufficiency that shaped how they felt about themselves and their place in the world. Your ancestors weren't lucky to have these skills because civilization was less stable. They were fortunate to have these skills because the skills themselves made them stable. The knowledge is resilience. The habit is protection. The competence is freedom. Here's what you're going to do this week. Pick one vegetable. Pick one method. Read up on it. Get the materials. Do it small. Do it with attention. And then, more importantly, taste it. Feel the competence. Notice how it changes something in your sense of self-sufficiency. That one small action, that one batch, that's where this all begins. And if you want the complete framework for building a preservation system that actually fits your life, that won't take up your entire autumn, that builds competence without overwhelming you, then you've got to check the description or the pinned comment. That resource breaks down exactly how to approach this in a way that works for modern lives. It's the missing manual that your ancestors didn't need to write because they lived it, but you need it written down, and that's there. The last thing I want to leave you with is this. Your ancestors weren't superhuman. They weren't dramatically more competent or more disciplined than you. They just lived in a world where preservation was necessary, so they did it. You live in a world where it's optional. That optionality is actually your advantage. You can approach preservation as a skill to master rather than a chore to survive. You can build competence without desperation. You can develop self-sufficiency as a choice rather than an obligation. And that choice, that deliberate choice to develop these skills, that's actually more powerful than having them forced upon you. So thank you so much for watching this. I know this was a different take on preservation than you might have expected, but I hope it cracked open some new ways of thinking about why your ancestors did what they did and what that knowledge means for you today. Please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss when we go deeper on topics like this. And if this resonated with you, leave a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are hungry to think differently about survival, resilience, and self-sufficiency.